Welcome to this video podcast. In collaboration with the Royal Swedish Academy of War Sciences and its SVAR project, we examine Sweden's path towards NATO and the EU, as well as issues of deterrence and resilience. How are these affected by NATO membership, developments in the USA, and the war that Russia initiated against Ukraine in 2014, which escalated into a full-scale invasion in 2022? In recent years, questions about nuclear deterrence have increased, particularly after Donald Trump's second term as President of the United States. What can we really expect from US support in an existential crisis? Is it enough for Europe to double its defense spending, or will the demands for European efforts increase before the USA provides the necessary backstop on conventional and nuclear levels? Particular focus this time is put on the risk for a global systems collapse, short of nuclear Armageddon in the form of a World War III. The conversation begins on the basis of an AI-generated document collecting sources, updating the SVAR midterm report, published and finalized at the beginning of this year. Michael Sahlin, a member of the Academy and with a broad security policy background as State Secretary in the Ministry of Defense and Ambassador in several key positions in Europe, will participate. He will place the issues in a larger security policy context.
So, good morning, Michael. Now from my countryside in mid-Sweden, it's a bit cloudy outside, wonderful day yesterday, but today a little bit rainy, so I'm happy to spend the first hours of Easter recording this pod, which is based on a very long discussion we had, a tentative discussion we had yesterday, about 1.5 hours, about the global system unraveling. Where we've asked a couple of AI voices to synthesize what we came up with, and the result is an audio script which we will play for our listeners, and in parallel a slide show which follows this presentation, and then for each one of these slides you will comment and I will comment a little bit if necessary. So if you're okay, we'll just get on with it.
Okay.
You know, you've shared some really thought-provoking material with us, articles, expert discussions, and honestly, it paints a pretty concerning picture of, well, where things might be heading globally.
Yeah.
So in this deep dive, our aim is really to cut through some of the noise, the headlines, and get to the core insights, you know?
Precisely. And what really stands out, I think, is this potential unraveling of the current global system.
Right.
A shift towards something much more unstable, driven more by individual national interests instead of collective agreements.
That Hobbesian idea you mentioned.
Exactly. That's the term often used, a Hobbesian order. Basically, a world driven by self-interest, maybe a lack of that overarching authority we've gotten used to.
Let's stop there for a second, Mike. We spoke about Hobbesian or Hobbesian, and I checked. They actually pronounce it wrong. We spell it right, but they pronounced it wrong. It should be Hobbesian. As you said.
Yeah, so I was right. Okay.
You were right. Absolutely.
Okay. And we've got quite a mix of material here, right? An audio discussion, some analytical documents.
A good blend, yeah.
So our mission really is to synthesize all of this, connect the dots, try and build a more complete understanding. We want to grasp the forces behind this potential shift, what it could mean, especially for, say, smaller nations like Sweden, and what adaptations might be needed.
And it's crucial to frame this correctly. We're exploring a plausible scenario here, not, making hard predictions.
Definitely not predicting the future.
The experts in that audio source, they actually called it the second worst case scenario.
Right. Less catastrophic than, thankfully, global nuclear war, which we are setting aside for this discussion.
Intentionally, yes.
But still, as they said, deeply ominous.
They used the phrase uncharted territory. I think that really captures it. Venturing into times we haven't quite seen before.
Okay, so let's unpack this idea, this conglomerate scenario, as one of the sources put it.
Yeah.
And as the first thing that really strikes you is it's not just one crisis happening, is it?
No, not at all.
It feels much more like a cluster, a whole bunch of negative trends converging, kind of feeding off each other.
That's a really crucial insight.
Okay.
These aren't just isolated little pockets of trouble. They're interconnected, creating this synergistic effect almost.
Yeah.
And Michael Sahlin, in the audio, he made the point that these trends aren't just wild speculation.
No, they're based on stuff we can see.
Exactly. Rooted in observable realities, logical extrapolations of where things are already going.
Lars-Erik Lundin, he used that specific term, conglomerate scenario, didn't he, to describe how these different dimensions and sub-scenarios link up.
And Sahlin echoed that. Called it less dangerous than total annihilation, sure, but still very ominous.
Yeah, it really underlines why this feels so worrying. And hopefully for listeners, it...
Yeah, let's stop there for a second. Let's see. You wanted to add something here, Michael, or whether we should just proceed?
Well, I think the AI personalities pointed to the main points of reference here: the synergy between trends, the observability of trends, and the resulting conglomeracy in the scenario, which is a step into something unknown, but still definitely happening. So that's okay. We can continue.
We can continue. So we go into the next slide, and let's hope that the AI colleagues follow us.
Help show how these different issues compound each other rather than just feeling overwhelmed by, any single one.
And what's fascinating, or maybe alarming, is how the erosion of multilateralism, international cooperation, and the weakening of norms seems to be a catalyst.
Like it enables the other bad stuff.
Sort of, yeah. The very institutions and shared understandings that gave us some kind of global framework, they're under serious strain now.
Michael Sahlin's analysis, thinking about the post-World War II and then the post-Cold War order, that seems key here.
Absolutely.
He highlighted how the winners effectively shaped those institutions and the norms that went with them.
Precisely. And now we're seeing that whole established order being questioned.
By rising powers.
Yeah, the move towards multipolarity, a world with several power centers, not just one or two.
Yeah.
And also the perspectives coming from the global south. It's all feeding into this reevaluation.
And London's point in the audio about the big players, US, Russia, China, increasingly seeing treaties as, conditional.
Conditional on their own self-interest?
Yeah. That really hits home how fragile the system might be.
It does. It really makes you wonder how difficult it would be to rebuild trust in those agreements, those alliances, once that basic commitment starts to fray. And there's this underlying assumption question too, isn't there? For a long time after the Cold War, especially in the West, there was this belief that Western values were becoming universal.
Right, that everyone was getting on the same page.
And that this consensus was the basis of the international order. But now, as that consensus clearly weakens and you see multipolarity really taking hold, well, you see divergence. Different actors seeing the basic rules of global cooperation very differently.
Okay, switching gears slightly but related. This specter of protectionism.
Nice.
Countries turning inward, trying to shield their own economies. It feels like a move that could just, backfire badly and ramp up tensions globally.
Oh, absolutely. The U.S.-China trade relationship is probably the most obvious example right now.
Yeah.
How measures meant to protect national interests, at least in the short term, can just escalate tensions so quickly.
Michael Sahlin talked about that conflict, didn't he? Between the sort of immediate appeal of protectionism and the longer-term benefits of free trade.
And the very real danger that this poses to the whole global economic system if it goes too far.
And Lars-Erik Lundin, he even questioned if just focusing on
Shall we stop there for a second and see if you can...
Yeah, it's again summarized very succinctly. I would add to what has been said so far that the question of the coincidence between Western values and universal values, that goes all the way to distinguishing between the global order as framed by the victors of the Second World War, the later P5 in the UN Security Council, as long as they were about winning the Second World War against fascism and Nazism in Europe and in Asia against Japanese fascism. That was the basis of the post-Second World War order, economically and geopolitically. And then, of course, you had the winners of the Second World War falling apart, and the beginning of the Cold War, and the entrance of the nuclear factor, nuclear weapons, first owned by the U.S. alone, and later proliferated into other countries, therefore creating the Cold War based on nuclear deterrence and nuclear threats. And then you had the end of the Cold War, and then you have the post-Cold War added global order. And there the big question has been, as we have seen, whether that order was adopted and accepted by others than major Western powers, or whether it was based totally or to a large extent by U.S. power in the remarkable 90s. That is a big question, as we know, how this was handled and to what extent that provides the roots of the current problems. But I would add to what has been said so far that the question of the U.S. Is very much to the core of the discussion we are held now, because one thing is the trend towards multipolarity, meaning rising powers, questioning the Western-based universality of norms, of rules-based order, as a phrase that we use. One thing is declining U.S. power compared to, in relative terms, relative to other powers, rising powers. And the question of whether the U.S. itself, with its current trends, further erodes the international order. And that is something we'll come back to, but it's a very important added point. One thing is U.S. power, and the other thing is U.S. trends in the U.S. itself, in the defense of this value-based system.
And to find a point of reference in our history is, of course, then very difficult, since we had this cyclical development to the First World War ending. U.S. took the lead. We didn't succeed, so the Second World War came. The U.S. took the lead again, constructed a new system, but now in the third wave, we have a U.S. which actually tears down many of the foundations which it itself built up after the Second World War. And we don't have a precedent for this. We don't have a precedent because of this fact that the U.S. is playing a completely different role than it used to play after the First and Second World Wars. We also have not had the Armageddon after the First World War, after the Second World War, because we have so far been saved by the existence of nuclear weapons.
Saved from nuclear Armageddon, yes.
Armageddon, but not from the second worst scenario, which we have been discussing in this. Which we are discussing,
and not from armed conflict and not from armed conflicts in other parts of the world, obviously.
Of course. So let's.
Interdependence, like trading more with your neighbors, could really work as a fallback.
Yeah, he sounded skeptical.
He raised concerns about, say, transatlantic cooperation, even mentioning the NATO summit as maybe a sign of things to come.
If you tie that back to the bigger picture,
yeah,
this more fragmented world we're talking about, protectionism just acts as another wedge.
Right.
As countries prioritize self-sufficiency, put up barriers, that whole complex web of economic interconnectedness we've built up starts to unravel. And that almost inevitably leads to more instability.
It's not just geopolitics and economics, though, is it? We also have to factor in the huge impact of, well, environmental breakdown
Definitely.
and the potential for pandemics to become, serious security threats in this changing world.
Precisely. Climate change, it's universally acknowledged as a crisis needing a global response, right?
You'd think so.
But it's struggling. It's struggling to get effective international cooperation, partly because of that very breakdown in multilateralism we were just discussing.
It's like a vicious cycle.
It really is a dangerous feedback loop.
Lundin made that sobering point, didn't he? How a decline in global cooperation on climate can actually empower populist leaders in smaller countries.
Yeah, they can argue, well, what's the point of us doing anything if the big players aren't pulling their weight? Makes it harder domestically.
And the interconnectedness is just stark here. Climate change potentially triggering mass migrations. Sahlin pointed that out as a major vulnerability for Western democracies.
A huge potential stressor.
And Lundin really underlined how tough it is for individual nations to tackle these massive environmental issues alone. It's almost impossible.
He really is.
And then the thought of, future pandemics hitting at the same time as all these other crises. Lundin's anecdote about the civil defense planners being hesitant to even think about that added layer, that really brings it home, how fragile things could get.
It does. It's one of those moments where you just see how deeply linked these seemingly separate issues actually are.
Yeah.
I mean, the recent pandemic was a stark reminder, wasn't it? How global health crises can disrupt everything, daily life, international cooperation, supply chains.
Totally.
And the prospect of that happening again,
Yeah.
but maybe alongside major geopolitical tensions or economic instability,
Yeah.
that's deeply concerning.
Then there's the really grim reality of just the sheer proliferation of armed conflict around the world right now.
Yeah, that's another major trend.
It feels like we're
Okay.
seeing serious
I
regional
want to bring up something on the environmental issue, or is it on the pandemics? I mean, fairly clear
I think
cut.
we could add to what has been said by our friends that it's hard now to recall all the problematic aspects of the pandemic as we saw it only 4 or 5 years ago. It's incredible how quickly the world somehow has moved on in terms of focus of attention. But it could be replayed, and we remember also, and we should remember, the way the pandemic affected U.S. policy. Donald Trump at the time was playing a very controversial role as president when the pandemic occurred. He was, and we were saved by the swift bringing about of a vaccine, which was seen to be impossible to be done at such a short time. And that somehow changed a catastrophic scenario that was prevailing in the first months. And it also, I think, was a major contribution to Donald Trump losing the 2020 elections and then somehow providing a pause in the broader trend of political developments in the US that has now been resumed with Donald Trump being miraculously back in power. But we shouldn't forget how close we were to an even larger disaster. So pandemic is a real threat together with all the aspects of climate. Climate change is definitely happening. Pandemic outbreak may happen, but it's not a sure thing. There is still the jury is still out when it comes to the duel between vaccines and the other preventive measures. But we still have the measles crisis in the US and other bird flu. I mean, it's boiling there. Yeah. So it's not a sure thing. Climate change is definitely happening. So they have to be taken into account.
Wars erupting all over the place concurrently. Ukraine, the Middle East, Sudan, Myanmar. The list just seems to keep growing.
And the human cost, the economic cost, it's just staggering. And beyond those big headline conflicts, Michael Sahlin mentioned data showing actually a higher number of ongoing wars globally than we've seen in quite a few years.
Wow.
And then, of course, there's the ever-present risk of other major conflicts igniting, potential flashpoints like Taiwan or Iran, remain huge concerns.
Lars-Erik Lundin, he highlighted how competition for resources is a driver too.
Yeah, vital resources, like minerals in the DRC, for example.
And how nations use proxy forces, getting others to fight their battles.
Exactly. It allows them to exert influence, pursue interests, without putting their own troops directly in harm's way. It's a feature of this messier world.
Sahlin also pointed to Africa, didn't he, as an emerging arena for conflict.
And reminded us about the persistent threat of terrorism, which can absolutely thrive on or be worsened by regional instability.
And the unintended consequences, too, like efforts to stop flows of drugs or weapons, potentially leading to more radicalization. It's complex.
It certainly paints a picture of a much more fragmented, much more dangerous global environment. The potential for conflict, both between states and involving non-state groups, just seems to be rising.
And kind of amplifying or maybe accelerating all of these trends is technology, the incredibly rapid.
So, what should we add under conflicts?
Well, we should add the realization that there is a link that was pointed out before between those conflicts and the other trends in various ways, both as an independent and a dependent variable. The fact that the world has rarely, if ever, seen the simultaneousness of such major conflicts of enormous proportions when it comes to humanitarian consequences, like Sudan, like Middle East, like Ukraine, of course, like Myanmar. There are others, and there's a long list of conflicts, but these are the major ones, and they are in themselves have enormous proportions. We must not forget that whenever these conflicts are ended, if they can be ended, and there is no sign of them ending anytime soon, the consequences of them in terms of reconstruction, it's simply enormous and will be in themselves destabilizing factor, because they have to be dealt with. The problem being that these current conflicts, they represent both rising conflict between major global players, case of Ukraine, but also the lack of capacity on the part of the UN or to be dealing with those conflicts. In case of Sudan, for example, the forgotten disaster, where there is simply no capacity nor political readiness in the UN Security Council to actually focus on doing everything to put them to an end. So it's a double-ended sword with enormous consequences. Extrapolating each one of those conflicts leads into a very uncertain world.
And we come back to, when we discuss conflict, to the paradox that military might may not be a tool to deal with terrorism in a simple way. It may be in the way that simply kill the terrorists. But if you want to do anything else in terms of post-conflict rehabilitation, even with a huge military presence, the experience and lessons learned from a long period of efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now also in Mali and other places, are sobering. We really haven't found the right methods of dealing with this, and terrorism worsens many of the problems that we have discussed earlier, including the issue of migration, involuntary migration, etc., etc. So one way you can deal with it, of course, initially is, as Trump proposes, to simply withdraw, to go away. Let's not deal with these hopeless situations. But then, as we see, it didn't take very long before he understood that he had to do something, and the attack on the Houthis is a case in point. But the net result of that action is already in question, so to whether it actually reinforces the resilience of the Houthi rebels or not. So it's a hugely difficult. Think of all the work that has gone into studying conflicts and dealing with conflicts, dealing with the radicalization to terrorism over the last quarter century and more. How little we have seen in terms of results in this domain until now.
Let me add here, Lars-Erik, that we have been writing in our earlier reports about the coexistence between two major trends, both during the Cold War and after 9/11, the coexistence between north-south dimension and an east-west dimension in politics. In the case of developments after 9/11, you saw a trend there of starting to worsen East-West relations, but at the same time you had the US-led war on terror that led to various incursions and then disappointments. The figures summarizing the hitherto US-led war on terror, the figures are simply staggering when it comes to human cost, mainly in the countries where the fight against the terrorism was conducted, Syria, for example, but also in terms of treasure. It's the enormous cost and the outcome of this struggle, which somehow tended to occupy the West from the needed focus on the trends in East-West relations during this critical 10-year period between after 9/11, let's say.
Yeah.
So I mean, the figures here are staggering, and the net outcome of this struggle is still in question. NATO has tried to adopt the US case in its most recent documents from the summits, and they are trying to focus on terrorism, saying that this is a rising problem globally, and this is in today's world. But we are summarizing very problematic net outcomes of the US-led war on terror in the whole period since 9/11.
Yeah, and just to give you a case in point, take a case in point. At the same time as the Americans are scrapping their investment into soft power, the USAID decision, I'm thinking of the case of the flow security problems relating to the route in Sahel up to Libya from Niger, from Mali, and so forth. And I remember the draconian measure undertaken by, I think it was in Niger. They decided, let's stop the lorry drivers from sending drugs and arms and migrants up to Libya and up to the ports. Let's stop them. And for that, he was, of course, the president was rewarded in different ways by those who wanted him to take this decision and implement this law. Well, what was the result? Well, I had a friend there at the time who was head of the EU delegation in the country. And I found out during my work in Safer World, I was in the board there for a number of years, that she would have needed about 100 billion euros in order to deal with the effects of that decision. The lorry drivers were unemployed, and the question is, what would they do? Would they simply be recruited by terrorists and organized crime gangs, or would they do something else? But in order for them to do something else, they needed to be employed by somebody. But she didn't have $100 billion or 100 million euros. She had just a couple of million euros. So the international assistance, which would have been necessary to mitigate the problem, was not there. So this shows that this is not an issue for NATO alone. It is an issue for the international community. And we need to have people there from aid organizations and so on, brave people who are able to to work on this problem and who are resourced to work on this problem.
You could add here, Lars-Erik, that in addition to the UN Security Council being blocked from doing what it was expected to be able to do, namely to declare that a crisis is unacceptable and then go into it by whatever means. The other side of that sad coin is the constant lack of funding for humanitarian missions into those. You mentioned the one case. We could have added 10 or 20 more other cases where there is a dramatic lack of funding compared to what would be needed for Sudan, for example, or for Gaza or whatever. And that is a big problem, especially now that the US, and we keep coming back to the US under Trump and the trends in the US itself, having cut out the US aid and therefore somehow deprived the US from the usually indispensable soft power that the US traditionally has been able to deploy in order to deal with the crisis of the world. So that is so important.
So I'm underlining Africa here. I mean, because this is not a problem which goes away. It's just in the beginning of a potentially catastrophic development unless we address the north-south dimension of our security as well.
Yeah.
So
and the north-south dimension is important, especially for the West, because the West is carrying the load of the post-colonial part, which necessarily affects its relations to the global South differently from the global East, meaning China and Russia, in this case especially.
So let's move on, if you're okay with that.
Yep.
Piece of it.
Yeah, technology is a huge factor here. Double-edged sword, isn't it? Well, it's fostered amazing interconnectedness in many ways, obviously, but it's also worsening existing inequalities and creating entirely new battlegrounds for geopolitical competition.
Like the U.S. advantage in the service industries, driven by tech.
That's one aspect, yeah. And then the really intense rivalry with China in critical areas, semiconductors, AI, that's huge.
Sahlin suggested some economic analysts might be missing the point there.
Yeah, that they might overlook the deep strategic reasons behind, say, U.S. trade policies in this tech sphere. It's not just pure economics anymore.
And technology becoming a central arena for projecting power.
Yeah.
That's a key shift. London talked about J.D. Vance's speech at Munich.
Right, about regulating AI, the potential for tech interference in domestic politics.
Yeah.
It really shows this evolving dynamic.
And the Elon Musk example using tech to project influence in completely new ways.
It illustrates the changing landscape perfectly.
It really does feel like technology isn't just a tool anymore. It's like a fundamental new dimension of global competition and potential conflict.
So if we bring the focus closer to home, to Europe, within this whole shifting global picture, what's the feeling?
Well, the sources suggest the prevailing sentiment is one of considerable uncertainty, apprehension, maybe.
That makes sense.
The outcome of the war in Ukraine feels absolutely critical, doesn't it?
Oh, massively. It has the potential to reshape the entire security architecture of the continent.
Yeah. And then internally, you've got the rise of populist movements in various European countries and the potential for less cooperation between member states. That adds another layer of challenge.
Definite. Though there's still hope, of course, that the unifying forces, the centripetal forces, will win out in the end.
We hope so. But these internal dynamics certainly add complexity when Europe's trying to navigate this really turbulent global scene.
And the implications for Europe, economically.
Seems pretty clear. More instability, potential disruptions to trade, having to adapt to a more protectionist world.
Security-wise.
Again, significant. A more volatile neighborhood, higher risks of conflict spilling over, and maybe questions about the long-term reliability of traditional security partners.
And environmentally.
Also substantial. Europe's not immune to the impacts of climate change, obviously. That adds further strain. Which brings us finally to Sweden.
So let's make a pause there to see if we want to add something under this line.
I think one might add a focus on the concept of globalization, because the various, it has been mentioned before, but I just wanted to come back to also the question of comparison. I was reading an article the other day only about the collapse of globalization. There was a title of that article in the New York Times, but it was discussing also the comparison between today's possible collapse. We are using the word collapse here because we are talking about systems and their collapse as systems. And the comparison was with the era of globalization preceding the First World War, and the way the World War One was somehow killing off the then prevailing globalization in various ways, uninterrupted flows of goods to Europe, so that Brits could be having tea from India for breakfast, and then lamb from Canada for lunch or something like that. Now we have a different kind of globalization, which has somehow been seen as a blessing for a long time, especially during the 90s, with uninterrupted flows of various kinds, making one world, interconnectedness, instant impact globally on whatever happens. But as we have pointed out, Lars-Erik, many times, globalization and flow security being combined here are a mixed blessing, because you have negative and positive flows, and there is a trend now for negative flows to be the remaining non-collapsing, so to speak, part of globalization. But we have the connection today, distinguishing it from the past, of combining globalization with digitalization, and now further into AI, as we've seen. So it is simply making things move faster, move more in a way that is more difficult to handle, but also with enormous potential for positive aspects. It's a mixed bag, really, to talk about globalization today.
Yeah. And the benefits of the globalization period after the Cold War, of course, is very much debated now, whether it was too unequal, whether privatization and so on led to wealth being accumulated in a way which fed the populist movement and fed dissatisfaction. That's one. And then the vulnerability of nations. We had the notion. We had a debate already in the 70s about, after the energy crisis, about whether dependence is good or bad, or autonomy is better. And it's gone back and forth. And right now we have a trend towards more autonomy. But we are at the same time realizing that we are not self-sufficient in many of the dimensions of the necessary and sufficient conditions for prosperity in Europe. We don't have everything in Europe. We need to continue to have supplies from other parts of the world. We need to have markets in other parts of the world, and we need to be able to travel. We need to be able to send information over the internet, and so forth. So this is
And we need migration.
and we need people to do the jobs that are necessary. We are not the best workers in Europe, just as they are not the best workers in the United States. Volkswagen, the CEO of Volkswagen, has just reminded the American government that we could very well try to move production to the United States, but we're not sure that we get the workforce we need there. So we don't have, because we don't have enough skilled workforce in certain areas, and even American tech giant CEOs are reminding Trump that we don't have the engineers that they have in China. We don't have enough people who can construct tools for advanced electronic engineering in the United States. And it will take a long time to train such people to become as skillful as they are in China.
We need to add also here, Lars-Erik, that we have under the heading of technological advances, good and bad, we have the emergence of the hybrid sector, hybrid warfare, cyber warfare, all those things that are based on technological advances, putting the question of whether governments or insurrectionists have the upper hand in the development. You have the link to organized crime and all the domains of conflict that are not conventional warfare nor nuclear threats, but it's something that is brewing and feeding also conflict because it exists as a means of conducting power without or employing power without trespassing the borderland into open lethal conflict, including nuclear war. So that's another aspect of technological advances characterizing the present.
And what it all boils down to is, of course, the simple realization, which is so important. We have spoken about it endlessly after the Cold War, namely that we need a comprehensive perspective on things. We need to link the trends with each other, and we need to see the whole picture. No single organization can be a panacea for solving the problems we have. We need this international community. We need this cooperation between countries on different levels. Shall we continue?
Yep.
Specifically, given everything we've discussed, it sounds like Sweden could be particularly vulnerable if multilateralism really breaks down.
Yeah, the sources are quite blunt about that. They explicitly identify Sweden as potentially a main loser in that kind of scenario.
Wow. Why particularly Sweden?
Because it fundamentally challenges the core principles Swedish foreign policy has been built on for decades: reliance on international law, institutions, cooperation.
Right.
If global bodies like the UN weaken, and even regional alliances like NATO face erosion or uncertainty, Sweden, as a smaller nation that depends on that rules-based order, stands to lose a lot of influence and security.
So deeper integration into NATO seems obvious, but...
But, as Lundin pointed out, there are still questions about the long-term reliability of the alliance itself, the unwavering commitment of all its key members, especially potentially the U.S., depending on political shifts there. There's some uncertainty.
So what's the takeaway for Sweden, then? What should it focus on?
The sources suggest a two-pronged approach, really. First, robust deterrence, strengthening its own military capabilities. And second, enhanced societal resilience, building the capacity to withstand all sorts of disruptions: economic, cyber, information.
Okay. Deterrence and resilience.
Exactly. And strengthening regional cooperation becomes even more vital. Nordic-Baltic area, the EU, those partnerships become crucial safety nets in a less dependable global system.
So it sounds like Sweden needs a broad adaptation of its security thinking across many different areas.
Yeah. Carefully balancing the need for maybe more strategic autonomy with the absolute importance of preserving whatever cooperative relationships it can. It's a tricky balancing act.
And ultimately, circling back to that Havesian idea, the sources seem to suggest that if these negative trends just keep going without some major course correction, the world really could slide further towards that state of self-interest, maybe even a degree of international anarchy.
It's a stark warning. And the experts emphasize this is unprecedented in a way because it's happening alongside ongoing globalization and digitalization, things that connect us more than ever, even as the political structures fragment.
Is there any sort of potential silver lining, or is it all doom and gloom?
Well, there is perhaps a sliver of, maybe not reassurance, but a mitigating factor: the existence of nuclear weapons.
Mutually assured destruction.
The doctrine of nuclear deterrence might still, hopefully, prevent the absolute worst-case scenario, a full-scale global war between the major powers.
Okay, so maybe not total collapse into global war.
Maybe not. But even short of that ultimate catastrophe, nations like Sweden will need to be incredibly proactive, safeguarding their own interests, actively seeking out reliable partners in what looks like an increasingly challenging world.
So this deep dive, really, it's outlining...
Well, Michael, who would have expected that someone would call nuclear weapons the silver lining?
Yeah, that's an interesting line coming from you, Lars-Erik, as the investigator. We need to add to what was said about Sweden's particular vulnerability. What was commented on the slide and by the voices was reliance for identity, for political orientation of a rules-based order. That is fine, but we also, of course, need to say that our welfare as a nation, as a welfare nation, one of the welfareist countries of the world, is deeply dependent on exports. We are an export reliant country. Therefore, we really need to have an open trade system, a liberal trade order, which is militated against by the current trends of the US, as we have seen. But we need to emphasize that the dependence on the system's maintenance has both economic and political reasons.
Yeah. So we are coming to almost the end, and let's see what they say about the last slide here.
What the experts and the sources see as a realistic, though difficult, potential future.
Exactly. A scenario that warrants very careful thought and strategic adaptation. Not panic, but preparation.
Okay, so just to quickly wrap up the main points. We've looked at this convergence of pretty concerning trends. The weakening of international cooperation, rising protectionism, the growing impact of environmental breakdown, more conflicts flaring up, and technology acting as this massive amplifier.
Right, all pointing towards a potentially much more unstable, much more self-interested global order.
Yeah.
Kind of a Hobbesian drift.
And the implications, particularly for Europe and smaller nations like Sweden that rely on that order, are really significant, underscoring the need for, well, resilience, deterrence, and holding on to strategic cooperation where possible.
Definitely. So considering that intricate web, all that interconnectedness we've discussed, here's something to think about. What do you believe is the single most critical factor? The one thing that could either really accelerate this shift towards a Hobbesian world, or maybe, possibly, mitigate it?
That's a big question.
And perhaps, what specific actions could individual citizens even take to influence that factor, however slightly?
That's a really compelling question to leave things on. It underlines that while we've explored these huge global trends based on the sources, figuring out where it all goes next and what it truly means needs ongoing thought, doesn't it? And active engagement.
Absolutely.
So if any of these complex issues have resonated with you, our listeners, we really encourage you to keep digging, keep exploring the topics that caught your attention.
And I was thinking about our project in the Academy, where this podcast is intended to provide an assistance to the various parts of the project to orient themselves towards a bigger picture, so to say, to see the things that are common to everyone. I was thinking about our midterm report, which we did as a follow-on to the American elections, and the comments we got from some of our friends in the Academy that we're not talking too much about Trump, both before and after the elections, and unfortunately we have to say just a few months into the new administration that this attention to what's happening in the United States was more than warranted. It was really absolutely necessary, and it's there we are looking for the key answers, so to say. We also can see from what we did initially in the project that we were focusing on deterrence and resilience was the right thing to do. It was the right thing to do. And still, what happens to NATO and the European Union is crucial for our security. So we need to focus on those levels, just as we need to focus on trying to create more solidarity and compassion inside the Nordic-Baltic region, while at the same time perhaps learning more and reaching out to our more important friends in Poland, in Germany, in France, in the UK, in a way which we have perhaps also not done for enough during the years that have passed.
Yeah, my My final words on this, agreeing with what you said now, it would be to stress once more the enormous importance of the U.S. factor, not just the Trump factor, but the U.S. factor, because the current regime in the U.S. is underway to do so many disruptive actions inside the U.S. with the system of the U.S., the checks and balances system, but also the value system, making many commentators in all sorts of media questioning what does it mean to be an American these days? What does it mean to be an American diplomat or an ambassador representing the US? What does the US stand for in terms of and in comparison to all the things that we got used to that the US represents? We have to emphasize also that the reasoning here, extrapolating all those trends into a scenario where many or all of those trends go wrong, so to speak, if we extrapolate them, leads to a situation which we call here scenario, and meaning that it's not a prediction, but it's a scenario, as was said in the beginning. And in all this, I would point out US-China relations on the one hand, and the outcome, if there is an outcome, of the Ukraine war being the main variables somehow deciding here what will be the impact in the next few years. We're talking about next few years here. The Trump administration will last until 28. Mr. Trump's health permitting. But then, of course, you have Mr. Vance and others that are ready to follow up. So things that are happening in the US now are long-term changes which cannot be easily rolled back under a new. If the reaction to the current policies would lead to a changed majority situation in Congress, things cannot be easily and quickly rolled back. So we have to live with the US factor in this scenario of rising concerns for a very unstable, at least, maybe even chaotic global situation.
Yes, and it brings us back to the situation we basically had during the Vietnam War, where there were so many people in Sweden who were sad when what they regarded as their real friends in the world on the other side of it. This is the same thing now. There are so many people who are sad, who are not even ready to go to the United States for the time being because they don't know what's happening with a country for which they have so high esteem. So let's
On
finish
this
on.
episode.
Yeah. Okay.